incredible talks so far, and particularly, wow, Lee. I think having a legacy is so important, and reflections on COVID is really what I want to talk about, which is linked to this incredible book, which I shall talk more about in a bit. So yes, I'm co-founder of Wahaca, also an ambassador for the Soil Association, and also I helped set up a charity called Chefs in Schools, for which I'm a trustee, whose aim is to tackle national obesity through putting better food and food education into schools. I'm constantly intrigued by that link between intensive food production and how damaging it is, not just for the environment, but for public health. And really how we eat is so inextricably linked to public health, but also how polluting we are across the world. So that's a bit of what I'm going to be talking about. I will talk about these different things through my personal experiences of lockdown, through my company Wahaca's experiences of lockdown, and then just having a look at the national experience of COVID and how we've come out of it thinking about food in a slightly different way. So more personally, I got to spend a lot more time at home, and I think many chefs who actually gave recipes to this book, which is not chef at all, it's like really lovely home cooked recipes, people like Heston Blumenthal cooking very accessible, easy, simple things, as opposed to his normal, incredibly difficult, complicated recipes. Lots of chefs were cooking more at home, and it was a very creative time. There's not much to do other than watch television, read lovely books, but cook. We all had to cook because restaurants were shut. And as someone who's absolutely mad about cooking, that was rather wonderful for me. My sourdough started bubbling away very early on, got my kefir going to my local food markets. And quite early on, actually, I started talking to a publisher about writing a new book, which for me at least felt like there was some progressing, moving forward and combating that dreadful sense of Groundhog Day, particularly in the last lockdown, those awful January Mondays that were felt so dire at many times. I think if the last 12 months give me lots of time for reflection amidst the mayhem of homeschooling and everything else I was juggling, I think Wahaca also had a great time of reflection on how we could look at the kind of ensuing months where we were forcibly shut and how we could best use that time. I think most immediately there was an urge in all restaurants really to feed people. The restaurant shelves were empty, people were in need, and particularly in the early stages, that need to feed the nurses and doctors on the front line. So we teamed up with people like Angela Hartnett at Cook 19 to get our chefs back in a couple of our kitchens and produce meals for 11 ICU units across Greater London, which was incredible. We worked with chefs in schools to cook food, to put in hampers to feed kids in school holidays who would otherwise get quite measly school vouchers that didn't really do much. And then generally we were part of a huge auction that Hospitality Action, this charity that this book is, all the proceeds are going to Hospitality Action, which is a charity that really does look after people who've been adversely affected in our industry. So we were up to lots trying to help people. And I think the most heartwarming, which is an expression I kind of often take offense with, but it really was heartwarming to see how our industry reacted in these successive lockdowns, and that feeling of community that food gives, that breaking of bread, and how our instinct led us to trying to feed people in our community and to feed those people in need. So that was kind of wonderful. On a more personal note for Wahaca, we've always had this ethos of sustainability, and we really were looking at how we could reopen and really learn about the best way forward, because as I've already said, that link between what we eat and climate change is so important and so relevant, as we know more and more, and how, as we hit this kind of climate emergency. So we shifted all our pork and chicken production to free range, and we were really pushing ourselves on our vegetarian element of our menu. So we've always had about 30-35% of our menu being vegetarian. Now it's about 50%. In fact, 50% of our food sales are now vegetarian, because we just keep putting kind of mouth-watering veggie choices on. So that felt like a really positive way to open up our doors. In the third lockdown, we considered shutting, and we just took that decision that we should keep on opening. And really that was for the morale of our staff. 700,000 people lost jobs last year in our industry. And we felt it was just so important to have a message of positivity for some of our teams. Quite a lot were still on furlough, but for a percentage of them, and just to keep that feeling of doing something and progressing. And actually it was a great decision in hindsight. We sold 100,000 tacos from here up from today since December. People have been kind of raving and wanting to get hold of our food. So it's been great for customer interaction, great kind of feeling of positivity in our business amidst the chaos of our industry. Although, of course, that hasn't helped us losing vast amounts of money every week. And part of what I've been doing is really trying to campaign the government to let us open sooner, because all of the data shows that hospitality was never more than 3% of transmissions at the height of the pandemic was happening in hospitality. Much more was happening in hospitals, in care home centres and at home. As an industry, we spent millions on making our places safe and hygienic and good places for people to be able to come in and see each other, which is a very human need. So that's the kind of happening in the industry. And then taking a step back again, just looking at nationally what's happened. So there was a report last week by the World Obesity Federation that said 2.2 million of the 2.5 million COVID deaths happened in countries with really high obesity rates. In countries like Korea, South Korea and Japan, where they have really high intensity of populations in big cities, they had very, very low rates of COVID. There is a direct correlation between the health of nations and how their response to COVID has happened. So in the UK, we had the third highest rate of COVID, and we've got the fourth highest rate of obesity worldwide. 52% of our shopping basket is ultra processed. That is foods that are mainly made up of highly produced and environmentally toxic soy, wheat or corn, intensively produced, and then kind of stitched together by industry and the kind of mix of sugars and fats to produce cheap food that tastes delicious, but actually does us no good at all. In fact, we now know that 90,000 people in this country are dying every year because of diet-related disease. That's overtaken alcohol, it's overtaken tobacco. It's a national crisis, and it's no longer one that we can afford to overlook. I think for decades, people have been campaigning that we need to have better food. And the kind of general response has been, good food, that's a luxury. It's not a necessity. It's important that we have cheap food so that everyone can afford to eat well. But we now know that cheap food is not actually cheap at all. That same report said that £4.2 trillion could have been saved if countries with high obesity rates had put in many, many practices to look after public health prior to this pandemic. So I frankly, as someone who's been adversely affected personally, but also in my industry, I'm kind of fed up being told to stay at home to protect the NHS. The NHS needs to be protected, but it needs to be protected by a much more holistic look at how we feed our public and look after people too, because the other outcome is seeing this huge inequality of food. And the fact that by virtue of where you're born in this country and your socio-economic background is where you've got access to good food at all. Because whereas I might happily chomp away on Pringles crisps and kettle chips as much as I want, I know that my diet is bulked up with also fresh fruit and vegetables, and my body is good at absorbing all those good things. Whereas people on lower incomes are only eating this very toxic mix of ultra processed food. So on a positive note, there are many, many brilliant charities now looking at how we can address this. And purely with my link to Chefs in Schools, we've seen how 50 pence per pupil per day less, we can produce really good home cooked food that is much better for kids than this kind of awful toxic ultra processed food. I think we now know as a public that people on low income, it's not acceptable that they're malnourished and have no access to fresh fruit and vegetables. And there are talks about putting taxes on some of this ultra processed food to help pay for people on low incomes to have access to fresh fruit and vegetables, which do cost more, but it's so important for public health. So I think actually with part 2 of the National Food Strategy coming out at the end of this year, it's important for all of us to sit up and take notice, because good food is something we all need to take account of now. We've seen how badly it's affected this country with the harshest lockdowns of pretty much any country in the world. And it's something we can no longer accept. I think it's high time we all fought for better food for everyone, no matter what your background, and let everyone have that pleasure of breaking bread with each other and eating great, delicious food. So that's my rounding up, and a great way to do it and look after each other and people who've been affected badly by COVID is to buy this wonderful book with all its delicious recipes in it. Thank you.